At 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, January 3rd, President Trump gave two words that would change Latin American history. Good luck. 2.5 hours later, the president of Venezuela was in handcuffs aboard a US aircraft carrier, wearing grey sweatpants and blackout goggles. This wasn't supposed to happen. Modern international law doesn't allow one nation to simply fly into another, bomb its defenses, storm its presidential compound, and kidnap its leader. Yet 150 aircraft launched from 20 bases across the Western Hemisphere to do exactly that. 0 American casualties. Mission accomplished. The operation, codenamed Absolute Resolve, represents the most audacious military action since Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden in 2011. But this time, the target was a sitting head of state. The captured leader was flown not to a military tribunal, but to face federal drug charges in Manhattan. In this video, we'll explore how the CIA spent 5 months tracking Maduro's every move, why Delta Force trained on a full-scale replica of his compound, how the US neutralized Venezuela's air defenses in minutes, and what this unprecedented operation means for the future of American military intervention in the Western Hemisphere. Let's start with the intelligence operation that made this possible. We're going to examine Operation Absolute Resolve by exploring the 5-month intelligence operation that mapped Maduro's daily routine down to what he ate for breakfast. The military planning and execution that involved more aircraft than most small wars. The legal and geopolitical implications of capturing a sitting head of state. What happens next in Venezuela and the precedent this sets for future US interventions. And we'll conclude by looking at whether this operation represents a new doctrine in American foreign policy or a dangerous one-time gamble. The intelligence war. Let's start with what made this operation possible. Intelligence. In August 2025, 5 months before helicopters descended on Caracas, the CIA covertly inserted a small team into Venezuela. Their mission was surveillance, but not of military installations or drug routes. They were tracking one man, Nicolas Maduro. According to sources familiar with the operation, the team established what intelligence professionals call pattern of life analysis. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, described the scope of this intelligence gathering during a press conference at Mar-a-Lago. The CIA team documented how Maduro moved, where he lived, where he traveled, what he ate, what he wore, and even what pets he kept. This wasn't casual observation. This was the kind of detailed intelligence that allows special operations forces to predict a target's exact location at a specific time. The intelligence operation included a source embedded within the Venezuelan government itself. This insider provided real-time updates on Maduro's movements and security arrangements. The level of access suggests penetration at a high level of the Venezuelan security apparatus. Combined with signals intelligence from the National Security Agency and geospatial intelligence from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the US built a comprehensive picture of Maduro's daily life. But intelligence alone doesn't capture a head of state. The US also mapped Venezuela's military capabilities with precision. The operation required knowing the exact locations of Book M2E air defense systems, the deployment patterns of Venezuelan military units, and the layout of Fort Tiuna, Venezuela's largest military complex, where Maduro maintained his residence. RQ-170 stealth reconnaissance drones provided real-time surveillance in the weeks leading up to the operation, updating target coordinates and assessing Venezuelan readiness. What this intelligence revealed was a heavily fortified compound with steel-reinforced safe rooms designed specifically to protect Maduro from exactly this type of raid. Trump himself described it as a heavily fortified military fortress. The compound's defensive features included reinforced steel doors and a safe room that Maduro attempted to reach during the raid. The intelligence was so detailed that US forces built a full-scale replica of the compound for training purposes. Trump later revealed that troops actually built a house which was identical to the one they went into with all the same, all that steel all over the place. This level of preparation mirrors the approach taken before the Bin Laden raid in 2011, when SEAL Team 6 trained on a replica compound in North Carolina. But that operation took place in a nation that was nominally a US ally. Venezuela presented a different challenge entirely. That brings us to how the US turned intelligence into action. The military operation. Perhaps the most important aspect is understanding the scale of Operation Absolute Resolve. The operation involved more than 150 aircraft launching from 20 different bases across the Western Hemisphere. According to General Kane, these included fighter aircraft, bombers, surveillance aircraft, intelligence platforms, and helicopters. The youngest crew member involved was 20 years old. The oldest was 49. This wasn't a small raid. This was a coordinated military strike involving Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps assets operating in concert. The operation began in earnest at 1 a.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, January 4th, approximately 2 hours after Trump gave the final authorization. The first wave consisted of precision strikes designed to blind Venezuela's air defense network. F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters operating from bases including the former Roosevelt Roads Naval Base in Puerto Rico struck Buc M2E surface-to-air missile sites across northern Venezuela. Satellite imagery from the morning after showed Fort Tiuna in flames, with destroyed anti-aircraft units visible at La Carlota military airbase. Simultaneously, the extraction force launched. Delta Force operators, supported by the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, departed from staging areas aboard MH-60M Black Hawk helicopters. The 161st SAW, known as the Night Stalkers, are the Army's premier Special Operations Aviation Unit. Established in 1981 after the failed Operation Eagle Claw in Iran, they specialize in flying missions under the most dangerous conditions. They've conducted operations everywhere from Grenada to Tora Bora to Iraq. The helicopters flew at 100 feet above the water, an altitude designed to avoid radar detection. This is extraordinarily dangerous flying, especially at night over open ocean. But as General Kane noted, the weather had finally cleared enough to create a narrow window that only the most skilled aviators in the world could move through. The approach took the helicopters across the Caribbean Sea toward the Venezuelan coast, flying below radar while F-35s established air superiority overhead. At 2:01 a.m. local time in Caracas, the helicopters touched down at Fort Tiuna. According to military sources, the extraction force encountered immediate resistance. One helicopter was hit by ground fire but remained flyable throughout the mission. US forces returned fire with what Kane described as overwhelming force in self-defense. The firefight was brief but intense. Delta Force breached Maduro's residence to find the Venezuelan president and his wife, Celia Flores, asleep. Maduro attempted to flee to his steel-reinforced safe room, but US forces reached him first. According to General Kane, both Maduro and Flores gave up to US military personnel. They were handcuffed, dressed in civilian clothes, and fitted with blackout goggles. The entire extraction from landing to departure took approximately 2.5 hours. By 4:29 a.m. Eastern Time, Maduro was aboard the USS Iwo Jima, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship operating in the Caribbean. Trump posted a photograph on Truth Social showing Maduro blindfolded in a grey tracksuit aboard the ship. The vessel made a brief stop at Naval Station Guantanamo Bay in Cuba before Maduro was transferred to a Department of Justice aircraft. He landed at Stewart Air National Guard Base in New York at approximately 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time that same day. Trump watched the entire operation unfold in real time from a specially prepared room at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. He later described the experience to Fox News as being literally like I was watching a television show. Screens set up in the room included live feeds from aircraft, intelligence updates, and according to White House photos, a monitor showing social media reactions on X. But beyond the tactical details lies a more complicated question about legality and precedent. The legal minefield. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture of what just happened. The United States conducted a military strike on a sovereign nation, removed its sitting head of state by force, and flew him to New York to face criminal charges. This action has no clear precedent in modern international law. Democratic Senator Mark Warner, vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, immediately raised the core question. Does this mean any large country can indict the ruler of a smaller adjacent country and take that person out? The Trump administration is framing Operation Absolute Resolve as a law enforcement action with military support. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced that Maduro faces an updated indictment in the Southern District of New York on charges including narco-terrorism and possessing weapons against the United States. The original indictment dated from 2020 during Trump's first term. The administration argues that the president has inherent constitutional authority to undertake such operations. This legal theory faces significant challenges. Congress, not the president, has the constitutional authority to declare war and authorize military force. Multiple Democratic lawmakers have issued statements calling the operation an illegal escalation, an abuse of power, and a violation of the Constitution. Congressman Adam Smith pointed out that no congressional authorization was sought or granted. The administration also failed to notify Congress in advance of the operation, violating standard protocols for major military actions. Several Democratic senators who received classified briefings in December have accused Secretary of State Marco Rubio and War Secretary Pete Hegseth of deliberately misleading them. Senator Andy Kim of New Jersey wrote that Rubio and Hegseth looked every senator in the eye a few weeks ago and said this wasn't about regime change. I didn't trust them then, and we see now that they blatantly lied to Congress. International reaction has been swift and largely negative. France and China have both condemned the operation, with China viewing Venezuela as a strategic Latin American partner and oil supplier. The United Nations has opened discussions on the legality of the strikes under international law. Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, now elevated to acting president by the Venezuelan Supreme Court, called Maduro's removal a kidnapping and declared that Venezuela would never again be a colony of any empire. What makes this operation particularly significant is the comparison to previous US interventions. The closest historical parallel is Manuel Noriega of Panama, captured by US forces in 1989 during Operation Just Cause. But that operation was preceded by escalating hostilities and had broader international support. The 2011 bin Laden raid took place in Pakistan without that government's permission, but targeted a terrorist leader, not a head of state. Operation Absolute Resolve combines elements of both, but goes further than either. The operation also raises questions about what Trump means when he says the US will run Venezuela. At his press conference, Trump gestured to officials including Rubio, War Secretary Pete Hegseth, and General Kane, saying they would oversee the transition. But he provided no timeline, no definition of running the country, and no clarity on whether US troops would deploy on the ground in Venezuela. When asked if he was afraid of boots on the ground, Trump simply said no. This uncertainty creates a vacuum. Venezuela's acting president Rodriguez insists she will not cooperate with the US, describing Maduro as Venezuela's only president. But Trump claims Rodriguez called Rubio and is essentially willing to do what we think is necessary to make Venezuela great again. Rodriguez made no mention of any such call in her televised address, and state television continued identifying her as vice president, not president. The Venezuelan government remains in place, defiant, and claiming sovereignty. This leads us to what might happen next. The strategic implications. All of this brings us to a crucial question. Why Venezuela, and why now? The answer lies partly in Venezuela's vast natural resources. The country sits on 303 billion barrels of proven crude oil reserves, approximately 1/5 of the world's total, according to the US Energy Information Administration. Trump explicitly mentioned these reserves at his press conference, stating that US companies would be very strongly involved in rebuilding Venezuela's gutted oil industry. Decades of mismanagement and corruption under Maduro's regime had devastated what was once Latin America's richest economy, with GDP contracting by more than 80% between 2012 and 2020. But Operation Absolute Resolve represents more than an oil grab. It signals a dramatic shift in the Trump administration's approach to the Western Hemisphere. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a Cuban-American who has made opposing Latin American dictatorships a cornerstone of his political career, has positioned this operation as the first step in a broader campaign. Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart declared that the days are counted for the regimes in Cuba and Nicaragua, promising that the first of those tyrannies has not survived President Trump. The next two, their days are also counted. This rhetoric suggests Operation Absolute Resolve may be a template rather than an exception. The administration has already demonstrated willingness to use military force in other theaters. On Christmas Day 2025, Trump authorized strikes on militants in Nigeria. The CIA conducted a drone strike on a Venezuelan port facility in late December. A months-long campaign codenamed Operation Southern Spear involved seizing oil tankers carrying sanctioned Venezuelan crude and striking alleged drug smuggling boats in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. The USS Gerald R. Ford, America's most advanced aircraft carrier, has been deployed to the region since late 2025 as part of a visible military buildup. The significance of this operation extends beyond Latin America. China and Russia have both invested heavily in Venezuela, viewing it as a strategic foothold in the Americas. China has provided billions in loans and infrastructure investment. Russia has supplied military equipment and advisors. The forcible removal of Maduro represents a direct challenge to both powers' influence in the region. Their condemnation of the operation reflects genuine strategic concerns about US willingness to use military force to reshape regional politics. What this really means is that the United States has demonstrated a willingness to conduct regime change operations in its immediate sphere of influence, regardless of international law or congressional authorization. The question is whether this represents a new foreign policy doctrine or a one-time action justified by unique circumstances. What happens next? The options for what happens next in Venezuela fall into several distinct scenarios. Option 1. Managed transition. The Trump administration works with elements of the Venezuelan government and opposition to establish a transitional authority. This would likely involve Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader who won international recognition after the disputed 2024 Venezuelan elections. Machado met with Trump in Miami in November 2025 and promised to open Venezuela's oil and gas reserves to US companies. However, Trump himself expressed doubts about this path, saying Machado doesn't have the support within or the respect within the country, despite calling her a very nice woman. For this scenario to work, the US would need cooperation from the Venezuelan military and bureaucracy. Acting President Rodriguez would need to step aside or cooperate. The Venezuelan Supreme Court would need to legitimize a transition. None of these seem likely given Rodriguez's defiant public statements and the court's decision to elevate her to acting president. Without internal buy-in, any transitional government would be seen as a puppet regime imposed by Washington. Option 2. Direct US administration. The United States establishes a direct administrative presence in Venezuela, essentially governing the country through appointed officials backed by US military force. This would require deploying troops on the ground, likely thousands of them, to maintain order and provide security. It would also require establishing a US-controlled bureaucracy to manage everything from oil production to basic government services for 31 million Venezuelans. This scenario faces enormous obstacles. The US has not directly governed a large, complex nation since the occupations of Germany and Japan after World War II, which occurred under completely different circumstances following total military defeat. Venezuela's government remains intact and hostile. The Venezuelan military has not surrendered. Armed pro-Maduro militias known as colectivos operate throughout the country. The logistics of governing Venezuela from Washington or Miami would be staggering, and the political will in the United States for such an undertaking is questionable at best. Option 3. Prolonged instability. Venezuela descends into a power vacuum with competing factions claiming legitimacy. Rodriguez's government continues operating in Caracas, claiming legal authority. The US backs a rival government, possibly led by Machado or another opposition figure. Neither side has sufficient control to govern effectively. The country fragments with different regions controlled by different factions, government forces, opposition groups, criminal organizations, and potentially Cuban or Russian advisors still operating in the country. This scenario could produce a humanitarian catastrophe worse than what Venezuela has already experienced. Millions more refugees could flee to neighboring Colombia, Brazil, and ultimately toward the US border. Oil production, already devastated, could cease entirely. International sanctions would become more complex as the question of who represents Venezuela becomes unclear. China and Russia would have strong incentives to support the Rodriguez government, potentially leading to proxy conflict dynamics. Option 4. International intervention. Regional or international organizations step in to mediate or impose a solution. The Organization of American States, the United Nations, or a coalition of Latin American nations could attempt to broker a transition. This would require US willingness to step back from direct control and accept a multilateral process, something Trump has shown little inclination to do. It would also require regional consensus, which doesn't exist. Many Latin American nations have condemned the operation as a violation of sovereignty. For each scenario, significant obstacles exist. The managed transition lacks internal Venezuelan support. Direct US administration would be logistically and politically nightmarish. Prolonged instability could destabilize the entire region. International intervention requires cooperation. Trump seems unlikely to accept. Analysis from strategic experts suggests option 3, prolonged instability, may be the most likely outcome unless the Trump administration develops a clear plan quickly. According to retired Australian Army Major General Mick Ryan, the US military presence in the region is likely to remain as part of a carrot-and-stick approach. But military presence alone cannot govern a country. The broader question is what precedent this sets. If the US can conduct an operation like this in Venezuela, what prevents similar operations elsewhere? Trump has already mentioned Cuba and Nicaragua, but the logic could extend further. Any nation that hosts leaders wanted in US courts could theoretically become a target. The collapse of the principle that sovereign nations are protected from foreign military intervention, however imperfect that principle has been in practice, could reshape international relations fundamentally. So the US captured Maduro in a lightning military operation involving 150 aircraft, months of CIA surveillance, and Delta Force operators trained on a replica of his compound. After examining the 5-month intelligence operation, the precision military execution, and the legal chaos that followed, we can see that Operation Absolute Resolve isn't just about removing one dictator. It's about whether the United States has entered a new era of direct military intervention in its sphere of influence. This matters because the precedent is now established. The US can indict foreign leaders, send special operations forces to capture them, and bring them to face trial regardless of international law or congressional authorization. What happens next in Venezuela will determine whether this becomes a template for future operations or a unique event justified by unique circumstances. The oil reserves, the geopolitical implications, and the humanitarian consequences all hang in balance. Venezuela today remains governed by the same institutions that existed under Maduro, just without Maduro. American companies eye those 303 billion barrels of oil. Regional powers watch nervously to see if they might be next. And in Manhattan, a former head of state awaits trial on drug trafficking charges. But what do you think? Was Operation Absolute Resolve a justified law enforcement action against a drug trafficking dictator, or an illegal violation of international law that sets a dangerous precedent? Should the US be prepared to directly administer Venezuela, or should it work with international partners toward a transitional government? Make sure to subscribe for more geopolitical analysis, in-depth military assessments, and breaking news reports from around the world. Because operations like this don't happen in isolation. They're part of larger patterns that shape our world, whether we're paying attention or not. Stay informed, stay safe, peace out.